I'm Jennifer Tersini. I own and operate Raise the Bar Consulting. I'm so excited to see you today. Um, Carrie Procopio and Stephanie Papathemiou are also with us there on the Raise the Bar team, and they may also chime in. And at the end, even though it's not on the presentation on the end, we'll open it up for Q&A. For those of you who don't know, much about Raise the Bar. We are in our 16th year, just celebrated our 15th anniversary last year and ready to go for another 15. We offer fundraising, organizational development, and transitional leadership solutions for mainly nonprofit organizations. We have a track record of raising over $500 million at Raise the Bar and over $1 billion combined with our team's experience and serve in lots and lots of different capacities. So we're really excited to be here with you today. You know, we're coming up on serving close to 300 clients with in-depth services and thousands of folks with trainings and seminars just like this. And so it gives us a unique perspective. Um, and what we see is that a lot of issues that clients or nonprofits feel are unique to them are actually incredibly common, and others have solutions that could work for you. So we've decided that it's a great opportunity to share what we see um, and what's happening here in this sector. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you all here. Feel free to use the chat at any time today. We can stop and answer questions, and we're happy to keep this as interactive and stress-free as possible. All right. So today we're talking about our holistic funding health check, right? So you've talked to your stakeholders, you identified your own strategic priorities. But in these times, which let's face it, have been a little turbulent and uncertain for so many organizations in the sector, are your fundraising and revenue approaches matching and able to realize them? Do you have a diversified funding strategy to be able to be sustainable, relevant, and responsive in these times? That's what we're going to talk about today. So I thought it would be great to start off with a few visual examples, since so many of us are visual creatures. Oops, there you go. So ensuring that your organization's revenue is diverse and not heavily reliant on only one or two sources of funding will really help to ensure that you're in the best position to weather unpredictable times. So we wanted to show you what unbalanced revenue profiles look like and then what a more balanced one does. So here are two imbalanced revenue profiles that we see a lot in the sector. The first one would be one where an organization is very heavily government grant funded. And so we probably should have put a caveat that we were talking about government grants there, which I just noticed, but that's what we're talking about. So often we see organizations that are 80 to 100% government funded. Now, they may be funded with one or two government grants, or they may be funded with a couple dozen different grants and contracts, which is a bit more stable and secure, right? But their funding is primarily from kind of one area of revenue, and then they have very small pots of funding from things like individual donations, earned revenue, fees for service, retail, everything else, right? The second that we see, and obviously this is often from organizations that don't get a lot of government funding, is that in privately funded organizations, it can be really easy to kind of get stuck in a dynamic where you have most of your private funding from just maybe one to four benefactors, and that really is 50 to 80% of your funding. In our example, we're showing 75%, with the remainder of individual donations from small and mid-size donations to earned income, fees, um, interest or dividends on your investments, grants, et cetera, kind of all filling in a very small portion of the total. And then what's ideal, of course, is a more balanced revenue profile where you grow each bucket enough so that your, sort of pie charts of revenue look a little more like the last two examples. So in the first, um, I guess in both examples, we've got grants pretty evenly distributed. As well as all other sources of funding. If this was to look a little more dramatic, we would see that in some examples, you might have a lot more money from social enterprise or earned revenue and fundraising, and a much smaller amount from grants. And in another, you might have more from grants and less from those others. So, um, just wanted to give you a sense of what that pie chart really ideally would look like for a well-balanced organization. It's never perfect. Every organization is different, but the more you can get to a reality that looks like our examples, the more sustainable and protected your organization is to continue to serve your mission. So let's talk about a holistic funding plan checklist. First and foremost, we want to know, do you have practical fundraising and, even revenue goals? Maybe they should say revenue goals. Um, are they achievable? Are they agreed upon targets? And do they really reflect your organization's priorities, your fundraising strategies, your organizational capacity, the investments you're making in your work, and in growing your business? So let's talk about um, nonprofit. So nonprofit is a tax status, but often we think, oh, we can't make money with what we do. Well, that is untrue. You absolutely can charge for your services. You can make money. You can make income. You can actually make a profit in your lines of service. I know we don't like to use the P word in nonprofits. We call it, does anybody know what we call it? Excess revenue over expenses. Very clinical accounting term. But what you can't do is you can't pay out to shareholders. So you need to reinvest that profit, if you will, into your mission work. That is not very difficult for nonprofits to do, given the deep needs that most of us see in our communities and our desires to want to compensate staff at market rates and so forth, right? Offer good benefits and all that. You can do all that with the funds that you bring in to better support your mission. Um, so what we're really talking about here is, getting back to those practical goals. Are you investing in your lines of fundraising, your lines of business in ways that are going to meet the financial goals that you have decided on for the year, right? Um, and lots of times we see that, there's an imbalance there. There also can be an imbalance of the human resources that are dedicated to make these efforts happen, right? So, first and foremost, let's talk about prospecting, cultivation, and stewardship. You might also call it leads generation in certain lines of business or service. So, first, with your individual donors, do you conduct a wealth propensity data analysis of your database? Have you done, in essence, have you done your homework in researching who's in your database, um, what their affinities are, and what is their capacity to give? And then, in addition, what's their propensity to give? If you're embarking on major gift fundraising or capital campaigns of any kind, it's super important to take this step. It's easier than ever. It does cost some money, but you really can't afford not to, because if you don't do it, and I will say many organizations don't do it, they skip over this piece because, the board is just bent on starting a capital campaign, like come hell or high water, right? We're doing a campaign kind of mentality. And so they skip over this piece, they skip over the feasibility study. You're going to pay for it later. And you're going to pay for it in spades because while a wealth analysis might cost five to $10,000, um, it's going to cost you 10 or 20 times that if you engage capital campaign consultants to assist you and move down the road of fundraising if you're not ready. Even if you're not talking about a capital campaign, if you really want to grow major gifts, you have to know who has the capacity and desire to give. And all too often, organizations have no idea whether the people they are talking to actually have the capacity to give. And someone once said to me, and I'll never forget it because I used to work in plan giving and major gift work for a national organization for a number of years, really cut my teeth that way in that area of fundraising. And it was before we had all the tools we have today. And I'll never forget, he said, just remember, people who live in McMansions have McMortgages. And that's true. And I never forgot it because all too often we assume that the way people present themselves is commensurate with their wealth and their capacity to give. And that is often not true. So when you do something like this, you can really narrow the number of individuals who should be on your prospect list for growing their relationships and asking them for larger gifts. Okay. Is there a strategic organizational approach to your donor relationships that reflect your needs and your strength and your values? Um, and I would say it's important to think about that without getting too dogmatic. Too often, nonprofits assume that their donors, let me rephrase that. Nonprofit staff and leaders assume that their donors share the same personal politics and priorities that they have as individuals. That is often not the case. Don't make that mistake. We see it all the time. But the more that you can broadly appeal to people of various walks of life, the better chance you have of raising support for your mission. So, do you know your audiences and your channels? That goes back to doing all this kind of work. And is there an easy way to implement yeah, donor management, cultivation, and appreciation um, at your organization? So, we're talking about donor engagement, really, right? So, that those are things like VIP gatherings, membership drives, mission tours. Clear donor recognition programs and naming opportunities, thank you banks, etc. All that work, donor engagement, donor cultivation is super important to do because what we know is that donor retention sort of hovers still at around 40%. So 40% of the people who give to you this year will give next year on average. If you have a higher donor retention rate, that's awesome. But you want to make sure that you're putting efforts into cultivation or what, in sales you would call client management so that you retain those donors, right? Or you retain same thing on your if you have a program that has patrons or clients, et cetera, you want to do the same, right? So that you're retaining people um, who are paying for your services, who are coming to see your shows, et cetera. All right. So all that work is really important. It's super easy to skip out on it when you feel like you don't have enough staff and so forth. We have strategies to help you with that, but don't cut those corners. It's really important. Here's why. It takes almost 500% more money and effort to re-engage a lapsed donor than it does to retain a current one. 500%. In fact, after a donor hasn't given for more than 48 months, so just 4 years, the chances of getting them back is less than actually getting a brand new donor. Okay. Let's talk about annual fund. We all call these different things, but this is all of your private fundraising, not events, all of your private fundraising to raise your operations every year, right? To raise your operational fundraising every year. Okay. This is the fundraising that you budget for in your budget every year. So, are you running an annual campaign, an annual fund that is big enough and is doing enough work? We see that often organizations are not. So, regardless of your organization size, we recommend that you should have 4 to 6 campaigns annually as part of your annual fund. Okay. We're giving you some freebie advice here. So if you're in Arizona, one of those is around the Arizona Gives Day, March and April, big boost. If you're a tax credit agency, roll it all into one as sort of one 6 week kind of effort. We know a summer urgent fund drive works well, even with a matching gift component. You should have a board campaign that's very structured in that first month of your fiscal year, really getting 100% commitment and support from the board, either in direct donations for the year or in their pledge. Um, and then you want to have a November campaign and a December year end campaign. Um, don't merge them. Don't merge them. It's really best practice. We see our clients have a lot of success with these, and you need to be in the game when everybody else is. Sometimes we see that organizations want to get kind of clever and creative. I'm thinking that, well, since everybody's in the space around Giving Tuesday and that last week of the year, we're just going to send, in the second week of December. That's a response killer. We know when people are looking to give, be in the game at those times. Um, so if you're a larger organization, you already do all of these things, you're a more well-oiled machine, we're going to challenge you to do even more. Move to, 9 to 12 campaigns a year and think more about the segmentation of each campaign each month. So maybe not everybody gets the same, generic mailing or message, right? Um, Here's another piece. Add first time donor, second time donor, and win back programs and strategies. It doesn't have to be um, a lot of effort. It could start out by saying, well, for any first time donors, we're going to send them a special welcome packet in addition to the thank you letter. For a second time donor, we're going to do something a little special or unique. And for anyone who comes back as a lapsed donor, we're going to, recognize that we're happy to see them again and maybe then try to bring them back in the fold like a first time donor and send them that welcome packet that's slightly different. Doesn't have to take a lot of effort once this gets systemized. What it takes 5 to 10 minutes more than what you're already spending sending out acknowledgments. And if you're not sending out acknowledgments, you need to do that first, right? Start doing that. Make sure those acknowledgments are going out 48 to 72 hours. um, Business hours, of course, after, or business days, I should say, not hours, after you get that gift. You don't want your donors to wait and wonder, did they even realize I made a gift? And the auto responses are a good start, but they're not enough. Okay. So from there, I need to stop and say this. Like, we should put a big star, annotated star circle around multi-channel. It is imperative that your campaigns these days are multi-channel. So what does that mean? That means that your campaign has mail, email, text, phone, social IM, peer-to-peer components for almost every campaign. Now, you might run some campaigns differently. You might decide, well, for Arizona Gives Day campaign, we're going to do a postcard, but year ends, we're going to do a full letter. For Arizona Gives Day and for Giving Tuesday, we're going to do peer to peer, but we're not going to do peer to peer every time. That's fine. But make sure you're in the game with using all of these technologies and all of these channels because they reach different people based on the information, the contact information you have and your constituents' personal preferences of where they want to consume information and communication, right? So people who like everything by text, they're not reading mail typically. So you want to make sure that you're sending in all the different ways that your donors and your stakeholders might want to hear from you. And, one of the things we have seen is that all of our clients, when they add text, phone, peer to peer, their results skyrocket. Like, we've been in the business a really long time, as professionals. And we're used to knowing like what's great, right? You get a 10 to 20% increase, that's fabulous. But when we're seeing 50 to 100 to 200, percent response increases on a response that had been okay to good before, well, that's incredible. And that really tells us something, that um, really you weren't reaching audiences. So if you haven't done this in the past, please consider onboarding these technologies and solutions. Some CRMs offer like a text component these days, some do not. You can reach out to Raise the Bar. We have partners set up in each of these areas, and we know about some resources that we're happy to provide you that information for no cost. Let's talk about major gift strategies. So, do you have a major gift program consisting of the following elements? So, first and foremost, have you even determined what a major gift is for your organization? Don't make it too low. It's okay if you have a certain criteria and you only have two or three or four people that have reached that goal so far. You want to be mindful not to consider a very low gift a major gift right off the bat. Okay. So once you've done your wealth analysis, the people in your donor base. I mean, you can also pull some reports and data from, of your giving from your CRM, and the folks who are already contributing at a certain level. You overlay that with looking at their wealth and propensity to give at a greater level, and now you can identify people who you want to stored um, in a more personal fashion. So those folks should be assigned to what we call portfolios and a solicitor assigned. If you don't have a development staff, that is okay. Your CEO, whether you have a development staff or not, your CEO should be um, someone who has a portfolio, who's working relationships with top supporters. Um, and you can use volunteers or board members as well if you don't have a staff. If you have staff, but maybe you don't have anyone that has an official development title, that's okay. As long as they've been assigned to do it, they want to do it, there's accountability, etc. Okay. So I don't want you to feel like if you don't have a fundraising team, you're in a world of hurt here. You're not. But it's also important once you assign those portfolios that you have a moves management strategy. You've thought about, how many times um, do we have to contact someone before we can ask for a gift? If they're at a certain level, where do we want to move them to next, or where do we want to encourage them to move? And give them some options. This is a subtle strategy behind the scenes, but you should know what you want, and sort of what your end goal is with each donor while you are cultivating and stewarding them, and while you're listening to what it is that they're really interested in doing with your organization or for their own philanthropic interests in general, right? And then your job is to really take that data that you learn over time and figure out how you can match that with making an ask that appeals to their psychology and meets your organization's needs. That's the key. It has to do both, right? Um, and then you engage in unique cultivation, engagement, and recognition strategies for this cohort and in-person cultivation and solicitation. Okay, the next area is, of course, government grants. Now we've heard a lot of panic in recent weeks about government funding being disrupted, going away, etc. Of course, we are not fortune tellers, but there still are some opportunities for organizations to be considering government funding, whether that's grants or contracts. It can be really lucrative and beneficial, especially based on the services you offer. For example, organizations that provide mental health and behavioral health services, they're really reliant on and do very well with this type of revenue. So don't count that out, but think about, what capacity do you have, and how can you grow that capacity over time? And we want to be really clear. Growing capacity doesn't always mean adding a full-time staff person to the mix. That's an expensive way of doing it. There's lots of other ways. And then corporate and foundation giving. So we lump this together, but in very large organizations, often these are two separate types of giving and strategies. But in markets like those that are in Arizona, for example, you can um, sort of tackle these together. So do you have the capacity and expertise to research, pursue, write, submit, manage corporate and foundation giving opportunities, which really is a hybrid between individual giving strategies and, conventional kind of government grant writing, right? Because you have to build the relationship and steward these entities like they're major donors, but you also have to do prospect research, often write and submit a proposal. It has to be compelling. So there's a lot of different skill sets are involved in this piece. Um, and it can be both and. So you don't necessarily have to wait to apply to these entities until you have a relationship. Sometimes the application process can build the relationship, often it can. But this is something to think about. Nationwide, we know that when you take government funding out of the mix, um, foundation funding accounts for somewhere between 8 to 12% of nonprofit funding annually. Um, Individual giving accounts for 80 to 85%, and corporate giving has remained constant since the 60s at about 5 to 6% of overall philanthropy. So even if the dollars have grown, the percentage of the philanthropy pie has not. This is the reason why it's really important to approach companies for certain reasons. But if you're putting all of your strategy in the corporate um, kind of part of philanthropy, you're missing 95% of the boat. Okay. And if you are in small or mid-sized markets, or you're in a major market that doesn't have a lot of corporate headquarters, the chances of you raising a lot of corporate money are not great. You'll raise some, okay? You will raise some. But there are definitely cities in the country where organizations are used to raising millions of dollars just from companies, not $100,000. Okay. So it's important to really be mindful of your environment and what's going to work. Um, there are a lot of private foundations and family foundations in the state of Arizona, for example. And so we find that a lot of organizations do very well in that area, in addition to private fundraising. Let's talk a little bit about planned giving. So, this is something that I think seems very mysterious to a lot of nonprofits. If you've never done it before, if you're small, etc. But rest assured, 98% of planned giving simply comes from inclusions in bequests and wills and pay on death accounts. So you don't have to do anything really savvy here in order to start plan giving and to cover most of your bases. The first thing is to ensure that you have a clear gift acceptance policy. And we can talk about that further if you'd like. Um, the next is, as part of that gift acceptance policy, you're really going to think through, what do we have the capacity to promote, accept, and manage? Okay. And even if what you are doing is just accepting those beneficiaries, you need to make sure that um, you're encouraging certain kinds of language, for donors to use, that your organization knows what it is not going to accept, even if it's a beneficiary. Because some things have a lot of legal liability. They can get you in trouble accidentally if you don't have someone who can help you manage it, and if you don't have the funds to invest in it. So, those are the things you really think through. But then after that, you can just start with some evergreen marketing for the kinds of gifts that you accept. I mean, something really simple like evergreen ads that just talk about leave a legacy. You can, remember us as a beneficiary of your estate or, that kind of thing, or of your retirement account. I mean, it can be that simple, right? But just developing those and starting to get that information out there subtly, as part of really everything you do over time plants seeds. Plan giving, I've always used this analogy. It's drip irrigation. Think of plan giving like planting a garden, right? You plant the garden, you plant the seeds, you water it. Over time, plants come up, some bloom, some fruit, some don't, right? That's very much how plan giving works. Once it gets a little more sophisticated, you can talk about developing partnerships with industry professionals, getting the word out there, helping them to be your advocates for their clients and donors. You can think about more sophisticated leads generation strategies and processes, and maybe even do some plan giving workshops. Next, I want to cover social enterprise. So, what do we talk about with social enterprise? Well, this is sometimes called social entrepreneurship, and lots of different organizations use this as a mechanism to generate revenue. It's not fundraising per se. But if you look at the stats in the last 10 years, the organizations that have incorporated in the last 10 years and are being led by younger leaders are using social enterprise as a business model and a mechanism through which they generate money for their mission. And so you see this in all kinds of ways, from the more traditional program and ticket or client fees to business ventures like charity water. I think that's a really common one people know, or ventures like, you know, um, buy a meal, give a meal, buy socks, give socks to a child in Africa, buy a pair of shoes, give a pair of shoes to someone around the world, those kinds of things. They're set up like social enterprise models, but so are ideas like thrift stores, for example. That's a really common one that you can see in just about every community, that there's some organization running a thrift store. The money they make is helping to fund their mission work, right? In various communities throughout the country, there are examples of hotels that are run by, homeless or housing services organizations, restaurants that maybe are run by food security organizations. Oftentimes, those very organizations will employ the people that they're assisting with services as part of an integrated strategy. But that's another example of social enterprise, right? Um, of course, things like other lines of service, retail, sales opportunities, third party payer systems, all of that is social enterprise and worth thinking about. Here's what we see: the organizations that have started in the last 10 years and have done that on average are bringing in 30 to 70% of their revenue with these strategies. These strategies are more stable than, I mean, of course, they're market dependent, but they're more stable than a lot of uh, the traditional funding mechanisms for nonprofits. And they're far more stable than relying on one grant or 1 to 3 major donors to save the day every year. Okay. So if you have the outlook, the vision, the acumen, the interest to move in these directions, it's definitely worth considering. Now, if you haven't built an endowment, that's a whole other thing, but moving on to endowment and investment income, there are endowments and then there are restricted funds. And the next time we give this presentation, I'm going to differentiate that. But I want to just talk a little bit about both because an endowment is money, of course, that is given that needs to be permanently reserved. There are IRS rules and regulations. You invest it, but you can only distribute a portion of the earnings on the principal. A reserve fund, on the other hand, doesn't have those restrictions at all. It's just the board saying, we're going to start investing some of our monies and they're going to grow over time and we're going to put them aside in like a savings account. We're going to call it the board restricted fund or the reserve fund. And we're going to be strategic about how we use that money. But you do have full access to the principal and you can use that money however the board sees fit over time. So you might have those buckets, and then each one of those buckets produces either investment or dividend income that comes back to the organization every year. So we've bundled that together here for the purposes of keeping it simple. But this is all to say, are you engaging in investment strategies that are going to help your organization pay off over time? Okay. Um, your marketing and communication strategy should be aligned with your values, your mission work, and your fundraising strategies or your revenue strategies. If you're spending a lot of time and money on marketing and communications, that's just getting the word out there. That's no longer a great investment. Okay. So think about that piece. How aligned are your communications and your marketing with um, seeding your business, if you will. Okay. And then fundraising events. So lots of organizations have events. It can be hard to move on, even if you should from events. So we like to encourage folks to think about, are your events mission centric and focused on significant net revenue? Okay. Net revenue is key because we know of organizations that have galas and they say, oh, our gala raised 1.2 million dollars, and they literally spent $1 million on the gala. Okay, so that if you're spending that much time and effort on an event, it should be paying off for you in a really big way. And the way an event should pay off for you is that you can prove that you're building donor relationships from that event that financially pay off over time. If it's a big party and you're just entertaining folks, that's not a good enough reason to have an event. Think about what you could do with that $1 million instead of an event expense if you put it into social media advertising for your cause. Or even a much lesser example, right? Even if you're running an event that's going nowhere and you're only bringing in $20,000 a year and you're burning out your staff and you're bored and everybody complains about the event, but nobody wants to pull the plug. $20,000 in Google advertising or social media advertising to drive business toward your organization could pay off a lot better, right? And take far fewer resources. So we like folks to really start to think in a complex way about their events, why they're doing them, and what the value is. And then, are they meeting the financial needs of your organization? If they are, great, continue doing them. Um, if they're not, give yourself permission to move in a different direction. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about things like unification, streamlining, and pooling of resources. In some nonprofits see this as a growth strategy, and certainly companies do. At some point, you think about do you, on the for profit side, you think of do we sell to a competitor? Do we get bought by another? How do we grow? Is that growth, you know, lateral, vertical, or horizontal? Those sorts of things. On the nonprofit side, I think we should be doing the same and not looking at um, acquisition, merger, partnering with another organization or fiscally sponsoring an organization as a bad thing. I think that that's a challenge in the sector that, we look at that as a weakness instead of a strength. But if we looked at unification as a growth strategy and as one of being, of helping to ensure that services are sustainable for organizations and for the causes that they promote, that could really be a game changer. And then we just really want to encourage you to think about who's plugged in at your organization. Um, is everybody responsible to some extent for revenue generation and fundraising? And that means not just the leaders and the C-suite team, every single staff member, every single board member, volunteers, are all staff expected to play a role in revenue generation, even if it's not actual traditional fundraising? Do they know their roles and are they held accountable for reaching them? Um, in our experience, we see that the fundraising staff are held accountable, but often nobody else in a nonprofit organization. And we want to challenge folks to think about everyone having a certain level of um, responsibility and accountability for revenue, um, for stewardship of, whether that's clients or donors or contracts, and accountability for serving and growing in those areas. And then just like those fundraising goals that we talked about, check your budget. Are you budgeting for impact? Are you putting enough money in the areas where it's going to pay off for you by investing in those areas, right? So those are the areas, when we think about a holistic funding check, it's like, is everything moving really well in all of these areas? And if it is, congratulations, you are on your way. And if it is not, or you need assistance in any one area, there are lots of organizations and individuals who can help. We are certainly one of them. But I want to open it for Q&A, and we'll start with what's in the chat here. For folks who are still on the call, does anyone have questions for us at this point or comments you'd like to share?
Good morning,
Hi,
Jennifer. It's
Eugene. Great to
Eugene
see you.
Carter. Good to see you. And I'm going to take myself back off video because I am driving and I want to focus on the road. The
Yes, for
question that I
sure.
had, though, with a lot of things you had, it's relatively new to me from that standpoint. And I'm looking at it from a position on the board. And my primary question is, will we be able to get a copy of the slide deck for the slides that you use for this presentation? I took some notes offside of this, but I can add them to the slide deck if they're available. And so I
Sure.
just wanted to find out if that was the case, if we have that
Yeah,
option.
thank you, Eugene. We are going to give a value added to everyone who showed up today and who registered for the call. We will send this out to all of you in a follow-up email. Okay. I'm so glad you were here, Eugene. And I welcome the opportunity to talk with you further about your board experience and anything you need there.
Absolutely. And I do look to speak with you further. My first board experience was let's just say very educational. And so
Yeah.
this experience, as well as being educational, and the climb is steep, but I think I'm getting a lot more treadway. And so the information that you pointed to in some of the areas, although being new, is in the direction that I'm going. So I'm very appreciative and look forward to speaking with you further. Thank you again.
I see that Stephanie answered a similar question from Deanna. We got you covered. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you so much for attending today. We really enjoyed the opportunity to be with you, and please keep in touch. We're happy to answer questions you have, and we love the opportunity to just, chat as peers in the industry. So, without further ado, we'll wrap up and have a great day.